It's Sean from 18 Shots Golf, bringing up a very controversial player on Gears Golf. We have Greg Norman, obviously controversial for the reason of the LIV Tour, but during his heyday of ultimately playing some of the best golf, there was obviously some unique things that this player brought to the table. So I'm going to bring up one thing to reference, and quite frankly, I think the important thing to recognize right here is what he does from the perspective of how his body sways, how his body slides. So the one thing that I'm going to do here is I'm just going to bring up a few sway and thrust indicators. So we have shoulders, rib cage, and pelvis. Obviously, we have the bottom yellow dot, which is the pelvis. We have the middle, which is the rib cage, and then we have the shoulder, which is the top yellow dot. Let's just go ahead and watch this as it takes shape from address, and let's just watch the way the body moves in a condition. The pelvis sways a little over 1.5 inches off the ball. Ironically, the rib cage moves about half that amount, as well as the shoulders move half that amount. There's a little bit of movement off the golf ball. So again, not a big lateral move, but there's definitely a pressure shift. There's a little bit of a momentum shift, whether you want to call it a weight distribution or a ability to move pressure from the way he's set up to the golf ball to allow for the club to swing back and to allow for his body to turn. As the golf club swings from mid-back to a left arm parallel condition, there's more pelvis sway. There's also more rib cage sway. We have a little bit more movement as he loads into his trail side. When he gets all the way to the very top of the golf swing, we basically have this player that has almost doubled the sway from his pelvis up to his rib cage, but his upper body's maintained staying fairly centered. So we'll watch this from a completely different vantage point. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this back to address for us. Now, these dots from this vantage point do not stack on top of each other because we're looking at this vantage point. And let's bring up, just for the heck of it, let's bring up a elbow plane. Just from this vantage point, just the way the club swings to the mid-back portion of the golf swing. His hands run out away from his body. The arms are lifting the golf club as his torso rotates. We know what happens from a sway perspective. So now that we have Greg at the top of his golf swing, let's go back to face on. Now let's go back to face on so we can understand, okay, well, ultimately the things that could potentially happen for amateurs, we could have a lot of thrust, which means the lower body moves towards the ball. We could have a lot of lift, which basically means the upper body goes up. That's a result of an early extension. Honestly, that's the result. That's the effect of things generally that are influenced because of things that take place at the player's setup to the golf ball, the way that they address the golf ball, or the way that they move the club to the top of their motion. So if you're that type of player, honestly, that has a big thrust and a big lift and your head goes up and all your playing partners tell you that your head's going up and you need to keep your head down, you're really not going to make any improvements if you try to keep your head down. If you go down that route, it's going to create more issues, more problems. So let's watch Greg as he moves the club down to what we'll consider his downswing. And ultimately, when we get to about this point, look how the pelvis leads in a lateral shift. Now again, I'm going to take this back to the top of the motion, but look at this motion that he makes. Again, if we just looked at the pelvis is moving now almost a full 5 inches from where it was at the top of the actual golf swing. From a sway position, he's now having to what we'll call slide and move laterally to potentially get himself into a better condition into impact. Now obviously, when he moves all the way into impact, the pelvis is swayed an additional amount. He basically has maintained some structure behind the golf ball. He hasn't continued to move his upper body in the direction that the lower body was moving. which would cause all sorts of problems for a player like this stature. As much as we like him for joining the LIV Tour, we don't like him for joining the LIV Tour. But the big thing that I wanted to bring up, some unique things that this player did, and ultimately, again, how he releases the golf club. And interestingly enough, his lower body continues, and his upper body, interestingly enough, it really is allowing for him to stay actually physically in his posture. So if we look at it from a little bit different vantage point, and we take him back to what we'll call impact, obviously in this case, if we're at mid down and we just look at the thrust numbers, now we're looking at these numbers on the right hand side. So we're at the top of the swing. Now we go from top of the swing to mid down, then we go to impact. Pretty interesting to look at some of those numbers there. Obviously very different equipment, obviously a very different golf swing, but all in all, there's probably some very unique things that this player could potentially teach us. But ultimately, one thing that a player that's watching this video, you're allowed to have a little bit of movement off the ball, and you're allowed to have a little bit of lateral movement as you're trying to get your lower body back into a good condition to deliver the club down to the golf ball. The body actually physically has to move. You have to learn how to move pressure. What I would say is a center line balance trade. If a player's centered and balanced and they move to create a little bit of pressure shift into their trail side, they're allowed to move into their lead side. The one thing that we have to do is we have to just understand what the tendency is for the player, and keep this in mind. When the pressure moves into your toes, that's generally going to slow down that rotation of your body. I say generally, not all the times, but generally the pressure is going to move into the toes, and that's going to slow the actual player's body rotation, or it's going to cause more things to go haywire. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully this was educational. I certainly plan on doing this as frequently as I can when I have breaks, and ultimately just giving my insight, the training that I've gotten from Michael Neff with Gears Golf, to help continue to grow the game and help players better understand how they can understand their body, and they can connect their body with the golf club in a more sequenced and more rhythmic and more repeatable fashion. So I appreciate you tuning in. Sean Laney Golf on YouTube. I've got all my social media handles, and I plan on sending more fun stuff your way, and ultimately look forward to having some great content down there. If you have questions, by all means, reach out to me. If you have interest in players that you want to learn more about, contact me at any of my handles, and we'll talk to you real soon.